Everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name is Klaas van den Tempel. I'm a program maker at Cium Generale of the TU Delft. Together with my colleagues, we've organized a bunch of lunch lectures over the year in the theme of global philosophies. So there are some familiar faces here, some new faces. This is the last lecture in the series. Our speaker today is Dorine. She's actually the one who also opened the series back in September to talk about global philosophies and how they look differently at the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. We're going to look more specifically at the topic of indigenous philosophy in South America today and how it has influenced, actually it's a pretty new movement, the concept of giving rights to nature, and also how that has had legal repercussions in South America. So we're going to find all about this concept, but also the impact that it's had, the successes and the failures over the last few decades. Very fascinating story. I'm glad you guys have joined us to hear it, to witness it, to listen. We have about 30 minutes of presentation. After that, Dorine is going to interact with us. We're going to have about 10 minutes to have questions, conversations, etc. Yeah, Dorine, you are a diplomat by career, but also a researcher, an artist, a policymaker. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about your interest in this topic? And then I'm just going to give you the microphone because we don't have more than one microphone. And then you can get started with your presentation. Can we get a warm applause, first of all, for Dorine today? Thank you.
Thank you, Klaas. Yeah, how did I get to become a researcher when I'm actually an official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? That's a long story, which I'm going to cut short. But I was interested in development issues, and I noticed by living in different countries that the philosophy of the people and the culture of the people are not always taken into account when we devise development policies. So I raised that point, and I felt that there was not enough repercussion or enough attention for that point. So I decided to write the point down. So I did a PhD research on the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the Ecuadorian or Quechua philosophy of Buen Vivir that we will speak about today, and thirdly, the Buddhist philosophy of gross national habitats in Bhutan. So we've talked about that in the first lecture, so today we're only going to focus on Latin America. If you want to ask me more questions about my personal experience, we can talk about that later. But I have a lot of slides for you today, so I'm going to start with the presentation, which is about the rights of nature in Ecuador. And I really love this picture because when I look at this picture, I feel like going for a walk in nature. For those who do not know exactly where Ecuador is, I put a little map for you in, of the location in Latin America. So first I'm going to tell you a tiny little bit about the philosophy of Buen Vivir. And Buen Vivir is a Spanish term for what in English we would call good living, but it is actually derived from a Quechua term, and Quechua is an indigenous group in Ecuador, and they call it Sumak Kawsay. Sumak Kawsay actually means Suma is the best, and Kawsay is living, and it's a verb, it's not a noun. So it's about the right way of living. So the right way of living for many indigenous peoples is about living in harmony with nature. So it's what we call a biocentric way of living, and that means the human being is not the center of everything, because if the human being is the center of our thinking, we call that anthropocentric. Welcome. Anthropocentric way of looking at life. So it's very different from a Western perspective, which is more anthropocentric, which separates humans from nature and tends to put human above nature. In the biocentric way of thinking, actually all living beings are equal, and they are in relationship with one another, and they have to have balance and harmony in how they relate to one another. So those of you who've been to my previous lecture may recognize this picture. I don't know if anybody was at my first lecture. No? Okay, well, the picture is a picture of Mother Earth, and Mother Earth is a very central notion in Buen Vivir or in the indigenous philosophies, and that signifies that the earth is basically the life giver, and the earth is the center in their way of thinking. So it's also the center of governance systems and the center of your good way of living. So as you see, harmony with nature leads to a cyclical way of thinking, and it leads to a thinking where humans are equal to other living beings. And that has translated itself in Ecuador, and Ecuador was the first country to do that, and so far the only one to enshrine rights of nature in its constitution in 2008. So there was a lot of debate. You can see here the hall where they debated the constitution of Ecuador, which was totally centered around Buen Vivir. So Buen Vivir has become an indigenous philosophy on which the constitution is based. So it's a very different constitution from many Western constitutions. And there was a lot of oppositions against that concept of rights of nature. So the people who opposed that said, why should we have rights of nature? Because law is devised for human beings. So law is there to regulate human relations. And other than that, they also said, you know, nature doesn't have a moral ability, or it doesn't have a rational ability. So why should we make nature a legal person? Nature cannot talk for itself. It cannot think for itself. So why? They also said, you know, nature cannot fulfill obligations because rights are always correlated with obligations. So, for example, if nature causes damage, we cannot sue nature for causing a storm and say, yeah, you have to pay us humans. So we are not equal, nature and humans. And there were also people who said, you know, if we have rights of nature, then there will be so many law cases, there will be excessive litigation. So it's not a wise idea. And then another argument was that we find it scientifically very difficult to establish what nature is, what an alteration of a natural cycle is. So there were debates about that too. So anyway, the proponents at the end won, and one of the arguments that they used, you see here a picture of one of the indigenous women who was also leading in one of these debates. And they said, but we have to recognize that nature has intrinsic value. So nature is not only a resource that we can exploit, but nature has a right to exist in its own right. And they equaled that actually to the idea of liberation of slaves. They said, you know, once we owned other human beings and we've abolished that, and we should also abolish the idea that we can own nature and nature is our property. We should restore nature into its rightful place. But actually, I think one of the most important arguments that won over the more conservative opposition was the fact that they said, but we have companies, and companies have rights, and companies are an abstract being. They don't have a moral ability, they don't have a rational ability, but we humans represent companies. So if we humans can represent companies, we can also represent nature and speak on behalf of nature. And then there was an ego argument that Ecuador would also be the first country in the world to recognize rights of nature, and that is what happened. It also happened in Bolivia, but not to the same degree as in Ecuador. So here you can see a little bit abbreviated what they enshrined in the Constitution. So they said in the Constitution that the rights of nature, and that is what they call Mother Earth, is Pachamama, should be recognized, and there should be a respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its cycles. The second provision, Article 72, says that if those cycles are disturbed, there is also a right for restoration and a duty of the state for elimination of the harm. And thirdly, they enshrined a provision which was about the prevention of extinction of species. And then I've also included Article 74, which is more an anthropocentric article, which says that people have a right to enjoy the good living, so the Buen Vivir, which is a central principle of the Constitution. So anyone can represent nature, and it's a duty of citizens and of the state to protect nature. That is what the Constitution says. Okay, now we're going from theory to a walk through nature and a walk through all the legal cases that ensued in the jurisprudence of the Ecuadorian court. So you see a picture here of the Corte Constitucional in Ecuador. And roughly you can say there were two periods. The beginning period from when they adopted the constitution to roughly 2018, and the law cases after 2018. So even though the government was very much a proponent of this idea of Buen Vivir and rights of nature, there was a backlash in the sense that they tried to influence the judges not always to rule in favor of the rights of nature. So I'm going to show you a few cases. I don't know if anybody recognizes this picture. It was a disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the oil spill of the Deep Horizon, which was a major disaster. And the environmental activists actually thought, okay, we have rights of nature in the Constitution of Ecuador. Maybe we can also, sue on behalf of nature in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, there was also a political worry about that, because oil and mining industry are very important in Ecuador for their own revenues. So there was some political influencing of the court, and the court actually said, no, the Gulf of Mexico is not in Ecuador, so we don't want any extraterritorial application, so we don't want any application beyond the borders of Ecuador for the rights of nature. So the case was dismissed, to the chagrin, of course, of the environmental activists. But you could say there is a point that Ecuador cannot tackle all the environmental disasters in the world. So a second case, which was also politically influenced, and I think this is the most extreme example of a court case that failed, was the fact that the government wanted to do oil exploration in a certain area in Macuma in Ecuador, and indigenous people opposed that. So they said, we don't want any oil exploration in our area, and it came to a conflict with the government. And the government had already built a road through the area, which had reached up to their village. So the government said, if you don't want any oil exploration in your area, then we're also not going to give you any development money. So you sort yourself out, because we need the revenue from the oil exploration to develop the country. So they said, okay, we indigenous people, we have a concept which you call community labor. So we will finish the road up to our village by ourselves with community labor. Then the government didn't like that idea, because then they would have had a free road and no oil exploration. So they said, no, you're not allowed to do that, because you're violating the right of the soil. Of course, they didn't go into the fact that they had already violated the right of the soil by building the road themselves, but they only applied that to that small part of the road that the indigenous people had built. So this was an example of how rights of nature should not be applied, because it was very unfairly and one-sidedly applied towards the indigenous people, and they got a fine for building that part of the road. So you can also see, the pictures of the protest of people against the oil exploration. A third case, which was had a more positive outcome, you can also see this a later case in 2018, was the case of Chevron. And Chevron contaminated the Amazon with huge oil spills, and there's been litigation going on for the last 20 years, in which Chevron tried to actually duck the responsibility. And they said, oh, there was a violation of due process, so they made it a procedure mistake. And they went back to the Constitutional Court in Ecuador. But then the defenders said, now we have rights of nature, and rights of nature has one advantage, that you don't need to prove that you have suffered personal damage. So damage to nature is enough to build your claim. So you don't have to prove that you got cancer or anything affected you in the contamination. So actually the court recognized rights of nature in this case and said, not only did it affect the population and had serious health consequences, but also it affected nature in a major way. So it was taken into account when awarding damages, and I think the damages amounted to almost 12 billion. I don't know if Chevron has followed up on the case, because that's another matter, of course. And I'm going first into the oil and mining exploration, and then we later come to some other cases. So another successful case, which is also a little bit a doubtful case, was the mining by small artisanal miners who contaminated water sources. And the government said, you are actually violating the rights of nature by your mining activities, and your mining activities are illegal. So we're taking your property, so we're taking all your tools and we're destroying it, and you're no longer allowed to do the mining. It was, of course, a little bit sad, because this is very small-scale mining, so sad for the miners themselves. It was good for nature, and it was interesting in the sense that the court weighed the right to property against the right to nature and let the right to nature prevail. However, if we look at the big mining projects, and this is the Mirador mining in Ecuador, the court found something different. So when you do an open pit mining, you have to basically dig the entire hill, so the entire landscape is destroyed. But the environmental activists then went to court and said, you know, we want a ruling on the rights of nature in the case of mining. But since the court was politically influenced, they said, you know, there was an environmental license issued, so we think that there is no violation of the rights of nature. And besides, the protected areas outside of the mining area, so we think nature is sufficiently protected. So that was a huge disappointment again for the environmental movement. And if you compare it to this, you know, small-scale mining and the big-scale mining, you may wonder what had damaged nature more. So the environmental activists then decided that they were not going to undertake any more law cases in that period because they were afraid of negative jurisprudence. But later on, the government of Ecuador restored the independence of justice, and there were more positive rulings. There was another court case which was launched a little bit more recently, but also with a negative outcome on the same mine. And then the activists said, you know, the dams that contain the polluted water of the mining are actually very fragile for earthquakes. And there was a huge disaster in Brazil, in the Minas Gerais, where the dams broke and then all the mudstream covered the villages and so on. So they said it's very dangerous for nature and also for people. So unfortunately, the court didn't find in favor of the rights of nature for this case, but they said the earthquake danger was not imminent enough to completely forbid the mining. Now, I don't want to depress you, so I'm going to go also to some more positive cases. And one of them was this community. These are the indigenous people of Sinango. And they demanded an end to mining in their area and also a protection of the rivers. So they spoke on behalf of the rivers, and they actually won their case. So the rights of nature were recognized, and also the right of indigenous people for free, prior, and informed consent. So the fact that they have to be consulted on mining in their area, and they have to also consent with that, which is a really difficult issue because there are many indigenous people in Latin America, and there's also many mining prospects. It's also an issue when you look at, for example, renewable energy, which we say is clean. It's clean maybe in terms of CO2 emission, but it's not clean in terms of mining the minerals to make it possible. So this was a very positive step which the Constitutional Court took. But even better was the case that followed, because it was not in an indigenous territory, and still the court also upheld rights of nature there, and said that in the cloud forest in the northwest of Ecuador, which is called the Yurimagua area, the rights of nature also had to be protected and mining had to be stopped. So you see here a protester, and on her left side, basically there's a slogan that says "Tomar agua," so to drink or to take water, gives us life, but to take conscience actually gives us water. So in other words, they asserted their rights of nature, and they succeeded, and that also secures their supply of water. So the rights of nature are in that sense linked to the rights of people. This is the Piñas de la Chuva hills, and also in this case it was said that the hills needed to be protected against the mining, and the rights of the communities who were living there were recognized, and it was actually also recognized that people have a right to good living, so to the Buen Vivir. And as I said, Buen Vivir means a right to living in harmony with nature and in harmony with a healthy environment. We're almost coming to the end of the mining cases, but there was one more which was really important, which recognized, here you see a picture of Los Cedros forest, and they also got their rights recognized against mining, so mining had to be ceased. So before you start thinking all the cases in Ecuador are about oil and mining, that's not the case. There's some other cases, but the oil and mining is very important for the revenues of the Ecuadorian government. So it's a very contentious issue. And the fact that these last two cases were recognized, especially the last one, because that was a constitutional court one, means that it's very unsure whether there can be any mining in Ecuador from now on. So there were also some court cases about agriculture, and here you see pigs from a pig farm. Not the pig farm in question, but there was a pig farm in Amparo, and they had a biodigester, and that was contaminating the area. The inhabitants were complaining, and they asserted their own rights to a healthy environment, but they also said the rights of nature of the environment is not recognized. And that was actually a successful case in the early period when, you know, the bigger oil and mining cases were all dismissed. Where the judge said, you know, the company needs to abide and respect by the rights of nature, and they appointed a supervisor to see to it that the company would also do so. This river also won its rights against agricultural companies and poultry and pig farming. Another case was here shrimp farming, which affected the mangrove trees. Mangrove trees are very important for the ecosystem. The shrimp farm was called Marmesa, and the shrimp farmer said, but I have a right to legal security, and I've been doing this for some time, and I also have a right to an income, and I have a right to employment, and the judge had to weigh the right of income and employment of the shrimp farmer against the rights of nature, and in this case chose to protect nature. Here you see a Pachamama ecosystem, which is a very special ecosystem of that area in Ecuador or in the Andes Mountains. It's a very fragile ecosystem. There was a person who started a pine tree plantation in that ecosystem, and the court actually found that it was not a suitable landscape to have a pine tree plantation, and therefore the pine tree plantation had to cease its activities. So the Pachamama ecosystem won its rights against the farmer. This is a little bit of a different case. In this case, it's about genetically modified crops. But I find it a really interesting case because Ecuador has also forbid in its constitution GMOs, genetically modified crops. So in Article 401 of the Constitution, it says that Ecuador should be free of transgenic crops and seeds. So they didn't need to invoke the rights of nature because it's separately stipulated in the constitution. But farmers surrounding these bigger agricultural companies were actually complaining because it was contaminating their crops. So once you introduce GMO, it's very difficult to stop the spreading of those seeds. So the court also said, and I found that really interesting, that it is a violation of the right to food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is part of the idea of Buen Vivir, where they say that people should have a right to have autonomous communities providing for their food. So both food and energy sovereignty are also enshrined in the Constitution of Ecuador. This is the Vilcabamba River in Ecuador. And Vilcabamba River is actually the first case that was won on the rights of nature. So it got some fame for being the first rights of nature case. And basically the government was, or the municipal government was building a road. And that road affected the flow of the river. There were some people living next to it. They first launched a conventional environmental case in which they tried to prove that it damaged their land. They lost that case. And then they launched another court case on the rights of nature, which they won because the flow of the river had to be restored. I must say that the municipal government didn't really follow up. They said we have a right to development, so basically the court had to weigh the right to development against the rights to nature. Found in favor of nature, but the municipal government didn't really do much, so there was another court case to enforce implementation. To be honest, I'm not sure if they've implemented it. So it's a novel legal concept, but it doesn't always mean it changes the facts on the ground. We're almost done. I have two more wildlife cases for you. One is about Condor Felipe, because one of the provisions that I read to you, the third one was about endangered species and the protection of them. Well, this is a condor, and a condor is a protected species. And this campesino, a farmer, proudly posted on Facebook that he had killed a condor. That was not very smart that he did that, because then there was evidence, and it says "Yekeaya justicia," so it means that there may be justice. So there was a public outcry, and then he was caught, and he got a few years prison sentence for killing this condor. So that was more of a criminal case, not basically a rights of nature case. Most of them are civil cases, so that the citizen stands up for nature and says, we want nature to be protected. But in this case, it was the government who apprehended the campesino. Now, the last case takes us to the Galapagos Islands. Those are islands in the territory of Ecuador, but in the ocean. And there was a big problem with shark fishing there, and there's also lots of, for example, Chinese vessels fishing on sharks. And whenever they were caught, they would say, you know, the shark, we didn't fish it in your territorial waters. We did it just outside the waters. So you cannot sue us, because you can only sue it if we did it in your country. If we did it in the free ocean, you can't sue us. And then a court case was launched by the Sea Shepherds, and they said, you know, we are invoking the rights of nature. And actually the court went along with that, and they said it doesn't actually matter whether you fished it in the territorial waters or you fished it outside of it, because it affects the entire ecosystem if you take out the sharks as part of that. So you're violating the rights of nature. So you see that in this case, actually the court does want to take it outside the territory of Ecuador, but the court, as you saw in the first case, did not want it to go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico to address the Deep Horizon oil spill. But you see that there is still some debate on it. So it was good, because since then it's much more effective way of addressing shark fin fishing in the Galapagos and protecting that area. This was the last case that I wanted to discuss with you. If you want to contact me, these are my contact details. And if you want to read more about it, at least the earlier cases, they're in my PhD thesis, which I called Development as Service. And Development as Service, actually, I wanted to say with that's reciprocity between human beings, but also reciprocity between humans and nature. It's a very important concept in most indigenous philosophies. And therefore, I made the word development as service. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Please. All right, I'm going to walk around with the microphone to take your questions. I'm going to ask you one first myself, because I'm curious. We focused on Ecuador in your presentation. What is really the foundation for why this has kind of taken flight in Ecuador and not elsewhere? What is it about the people there, the culture, the philosophy, that has made this concept of giving rights to nature being put to practice there and not, for example, here in the Netherlands?
Thank you for that question. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, in the Netherlands and in the Western world, we have an anthropocentric way of looking. So we are not so much geared towards this idea of living in harmony with nature. We think that we can control nature, that we don't need to adapt to the Earth system, but the Earth will adapt to us. We also know now that there's lots of limits to that. And in indigenous philosophies in the Americas, North and South America and the Caribbean, this whole idea of biocentric thinking is a much more leading idea. Why Ecuador? Well, I guess it was a constellation of the political movement, also of Buen Vivir. It was an environmental movement, it was an indigenous movement and a political movement. And it all came together, but you saw the same movement in Bolivia, but they only enshrined the concept of vivir bien, which is the same as Buen Vivir, and then put the rights of nature in the secondary law, but there was actually there were no law cases except for one. And they've also now put it in the Constitution of Chile, or they're debating the Constitution of Chile, and they've also put a provision in that constitution. So the movement is going further now than Latin America. I don't know if that's your follow-up question, but there are other countries in the world. There's been talk in India, for example, that has been reversed. That's a court case, but there was a question of the Yamuna and the Ganges rivers being recognized. in Bangladesh, in Uganda. So there are other countries adopting this now.
I can imagine there's a strong resistance economically, because if you exert rights of nature, then like you, with your examples, mining companies, oil companies, agriculture companies, suddenly they lose a lot of revenue. Yeah, what are the consequences for Ecuador at large by being so strict, by following this new constitution?
Yeah, we don't know that yet. So it was very contradictory in the sense that we had President Correa, who was in the Buen Vivir movement, talking on behalf of indigenous people who did not want to lose his oil and mining revenue. And in a sense, he was right, because he said, I can't do the social part of Buen Vivir, the reciprocity between people and the social transfers. I need that money. So he appealed to the international community and he said, we're going to establish a fund for leaving the oil under the ground. But you, international community, have to put money in it so that we can live up to it. But then I think only Germany was interested in doing that and the rest of the world didn't. So then he had a convenient excuse to blame it on the international community, say it's your fault because you didn't cooperate with the concept. So yeah, it's a very difficult question, because also if you want to make the transition to renewable energy, and if you're going to forbid mining everywhere, we can't make that transition because we need the resources. So it, as I said, it's a balancing between different rights. So if you want to be very strict in rights of nature, you can't do anything. I asked in Bhutan, why didn't you put the rights of nature in your constitution? Because Buddhism is very much about respecting sentient beings. And then they said, but then we're going to get Buddhist monks who say you cannot kill a worm in the ground, so we can't build a house. So that's the other extreme. So I think the importance of the rights of nature is that for the first time we recognize that it's an entity that we also need to recognize, that also has rights, and that we need to weigh that against our human rights.
Thank you. Anybody have a question in the room? A couple over here. I'll start over here. And if you speak your question into the microphone, then I'm going to run back to Dorine so that she can give the answer. Unfortunately, we just have one working microphone right now.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the presentation. Could you please tell us if you think that there is a contradiction between planting GMO plants and using them and upholding the rights of nature?
And your question is whether upholding the rights of nature and GMO are contradictory? No, that's not what I meant to say. I meant to say they have already put GMO, forbidding GMO in the constitution. So they don't have to appeal to the rights of nature because they already had a separate provision for that. They might have also appealed to the rights of nature. I don't remember. Probably the court upheld those different provisions. But I think it's quite unique that the Constitution actually stipulates that you can't use GMO. And what I understood from some of my friends working at the Waag in Amsterdam, that they were actually the ones who talked to activists in Ecuador who were drafting the constitution about this GMO provision. And they said to me, we were so excited that immediately they put it in their constitution. So there was some influence from the Netherlands also in that process.
Interesting. We have a question over here.
Yeah, I have several. Like, what I think the main one is, like, it says the right of nature, but as he said, it's biocentric. Like, humans are part of nature. Even before, we had like a lot of maize crops that indigenous people used and, let's say, breed, right? How does the rights of nature relate to its relationship with human beings, right? Like, can we not consume, for example, pigs anymore because we have to keep them alive and that's the right? Or is there any conflict there, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Because from what I saw, it is like, I saw that the rights of nature were mainly around restoration. Like, you can affect nature, but if nature itself can restore, then it's fine, right? Because it's a bigger problem. But it was also like prevention of extinction, whereas nature itself has extincted a lot of species, right? And it's kind of also a very problematic goal, you know.
Yeah, it is, as I said, you know, to what extreme do you want to take it, and where does a judge find the balance between your right to food and the right for an animal to be? So when people say I'm strictly vegan or vegetarian, I say, but plants may also have feelings, or we may also not kill plants. It's a very difficult debate. I think it's more about if you do not put nature in the law or in the constitution, then you're also not weighing its interest. And until so far, we have only said we're protecting the environment when it's harmful for human beings if we don't protect the environment. And that's, I think, partly why we are in the crisis that we are now, because we've only looked at our own interests, whereas there's so many other living beings. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's like giving it, it's like giving it more thought about the nature part, like more strength in the law, so that it's more properly included in the conversation.
Yes, yes, because we also represent companies and represent nature. That means that we recognize that nature has a right to exist and to be there, and it's basically equal in its value to us humans. So we are not more valuable than the earth because we can actually not live without it. So it's also reversing our way of thinking that we can control everything and we can exploit nature instead of what the indigenous people call gratitude towards nature. So actually the idea of rights of nature is also a Western idea because it's done from the Western legal system and the Western legal angle. So indigenous people actually say, but who are we to give rights to nature? Nature gives rights to us. So we should be much more humble and pay gratitude to nature.
So it's a very complicated debate. I'm also curious how that would work out in a country like the Netherlands, and also the question of what we include as being nature and what we don't. You know, whether it be a forest, like in the Netherlands, a lot of forests are planted. Do we count that as nature or not? And what about pets? I don't know. We're going to skip that question for now because I think you had a question, right? Something to think about.
Yes. So thanks for your speech. After all your speech, I actually still a bit hard to imagine what is the biocentric words you're gonna build. Do we have some quantitative standards to see what is a word we want to build in the future, according to your philosophy?
I didn't understand the quantitative data about.
I mean, like, so we have proposed a lot of constitutions to say we want to build a biocentric world, but I'm still hard to imagine what exactly the word looks like. The biocentric, for example, if we want to build a biocentric world in the Netherlands, what should we do right now in the city, maybe?
What we should do about rights of nature in the Netherlands?
If we want to transfer maybe Delft to a biocentric city, according to your philosophy, I was wondering what should we do? Yes.
I sometimes have a little difficulty hearing. So what I know about the Netherlands is that there's movements of people who say, for example, the area of the Waddenzee, which is already a UNESCO World Heritage Site, should be protected as an area and recognized as a right of nature in the sense that you recognize the legal personhood of that area. So normally legal personhood is only accorded to humans or to companies, but then you would then erect an institution which would speak on behalf of that area. So in other parts of the world, they have chosen that kind of an approach. So that's a more limited approach. If you put it in the constitution, it applies to all nature. I think also the planted forest class in the Netherlands. If you only assign one area, then you can at least especially protect that area and weigh the interest of nature better. Maybe Klaas, you can help me because I didn't understand 100% what
I understood her question.
Yeah.
It was, for example, on a practical level, if in Delft we wanted to make the city more in line with the biocentric model, how would we go about that? What kind of steps would we take? I think apart from the legal steps, right?
Right, okay.
I mean, we're engineers here. We want to know how to solve this.
How to build a green city. But I think first of all, it's very important that you have the conversation and you have the awareness. And that's what she said in that in this slogan, the conscientia. Here, She said it's good to drink water to give us life, but it's even better to take conscience, so that we can get life or get water or get whatever we need from nature or from the earth to fulfill our needs. So it's difficult for me to tell you which practical steps you have to take to make Delft a green city. I think you are the engineers and you have enough creativity also to come up with those concepts. What I want to do is basically instill that conscience that we've been educated in a certain scientific environment where we take the earth and nature for granted, and we take it for granted that we have control over it, whereas we know now that we don't. And that I think we can all find small steps in living in harmony with nature. Also means that you attune to nature, that you have a sense of what's happening around you. And that's easier to say when you sense what the person next to you is feeling, but you can also sense what nature around you is feeling. And I would say I recently went to a travel to Cuba, and I came in one of those most beautiful tropical nature areas, and then you feel the area so much teeming with life. It's so much buzzing with life that it also makes me a much more happy person. And sometimes in this part of the world, I lose that sense because we've built so much that we've lost that connection.
We had one question over here, and then I'll get.
Yeah, you were talking about how difficult it is to strike the balance between the rights of nature and the rights of people, and that if you would take it strictly, then you basically can't do anything if you were to adhere to the rights of nature. So, are you aware of any like movements of like attempts to try and do things in a way that doesn't violate the rights of nature, like on a larger scale, so not for like the indigenous people for whom it's relatively easy, but for like alternatives to, say, the mining industry?
The mining industry is a very difficult question. So for the mining industry to be in harmony with nature, it will take a lot of effort, but that would then also be a challenge for engineers in Delft to see how you can do clean mining. I'm not sure if there is such a thing as 100% clean mining, but you could think of mining that would be less destructive to the environment, or as the example of the mining dams that are often not constructed well enough and also pose a great danger to the people living around. What was the other part of your question again?
Yeah, that was it. But basically not only for mining, but just in general.
Yeah, positive examples. Well, actually, indigenous people, of course, are still very close to the roots of how they used to live. So it's not easy for them to continue that way of living, but they still have the knowledge how to do that. But at the same time, the people who wrote about the concepts of Buen Vivir, which is actually a mixture between the indigenous philosophies and also several streams of Western philosophy. For example, you have, environmental justice or deep ecology, but also human development. So they made a mixture of all of those theories, and they also took examples, for example, of alternative communities living in Germany as an inspiration. So it's not to say that it's impossible for us to change our way of living. It's just that it's going to take a huge transformation. And personally, I believe that if we don't go into that transformation, it's going to be very difficult to continue what we call the green economy, or to reverse climate change. Because climate change is also about inequality. How do we divide the profits of what we produce as a humanity? It's about how you structure the economy. So I didn't have time to go into that, so I went only into the rights of nature concept. But there's a whole economic concept also behind the whole idea of Buen Vivir. So it's about how you reshape society, and that's also about how you relate to one another and how you divide the benefits of your labor.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this would be also an answer how we would apply biocentric living in Delft. Like we talk really about a very small example, and I think that would be already changing mind would be the first step. Already changing the way we relate to each other would be a step, because these things, they don't belong to our culture and they don't belong to our living. So we need first to change ourselves, and then maybe we find the ground where to make changes and solutions, how to apply that in Delft, in our surrounding, in our environment.
Are you from Latin America?
No. No, but I've done some reading, a little bit.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I want to say how inspiring and hopeful I found your presentation, with the idea that there is, we're talking about giving nature a voice, but actually it's also giving human a voice, and that every individual can stand up and can make use of those rights. I find extremely powerful. So there's a question, of course, as well. But before that question, I have one more thing to add, that in Europe, the few countries I know, there are other rights. For example, we are not allowed to cut any tree. There are organizations who take care of what trees can we cut for this or this reason, which have environmental concerns. So there are other rules or things in place, including Delft, that try to regulate that. But it's not that me as a person can stand up and say, I would like to speak for nature. And I think that, for me, is the big difference. So coming to my question, in regard to the shark case, I thought that was interesting because so they won the case and saying, well, you're not allowed to do shark fishing there. And I suppose the Chinese vessels were fined. But what does it actually, how is it implemented? What does it mean for the Chinese vessels? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know very well what you mean. I must say, and that's maybe the shortcoming of my research, but I didn't have time to research everything. I did not look at what the follow-up of the court case was. So one thing is, how do we change people's consciousness? How we change our way of life? How we put it in the law? What the lawyers and what the judges say, and then there is a positive outcome. But it doesn't mean that the government or those who are supposed to do something are also going to implement it. So there is a book, it's called The Politics of the Rights of Nature, which actually looks into that aspects of what happened after the court rulings. Was it actually implemented? I know the Vilcabamba River case, which was the first prominent case.
Is that book very frustrating? Or
I haven't finished reading it yet. But with Galapagos, it's actually also a different matter because whole of Galapagos is a protected area. So there are different bases. You don't actually need to apply the rights of nature because the whole of the Galapagos Islands and the sea around it is already a protected nature area. But because, people were circumventing that provision and say, but the shark was swimming just outside the border, they took the rights of nature into account and said, okay, then we're going to tackle it from that point of view. Whether that also diminished the shark fishing, that also depends on how many boats there are to monitor it, how many activists are active in that area. So I don't know the statistics about that, but at least if you are caught, then you can be sued and you can be punished. Whereas before you were caught and you couldn't even be punished because you couldn't prove that
but
it was done in that area.
But it does mean that the Ecuadorian legal system would punish these Chinese ships. So when the Chinese ships return to China, there is no consequence. Like, is that going?
Yeah. That's a matter of nationality. I must say I don't know so much about the Ecuadorian legal system, but as far as I know, in this particular case, there was a punishment. Yes, there was a prison sentence and there was a fine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your questions, guys. I think we've come to the end of the lunch break and the end of the presentation. I want to thank all of you guys for coming here and Dorine for your presentation, of course. But before we conclude, could you go to the last slide, the very last slide? And I think we have a few minutes also. Is there one after this? Yes, this is the one I mean. After this, you're going to be here for a few more minutes, right? So if you want to come up and ask a question without the cameras being on, feel free to do that. So I just want to quickly announce that we have more events coming up next week before the exam before the exam period starts up again and the summer break and etc. We have an interesting evening, SGN Conversation next week, Tuesday. It's going to be a conversation, open conversation about identity, about coming out for your sexuality as a professional athlete. I definitely recommend you guys visit that if you're interested. We have a creative writing session, and we have a movie night coming up that's going to be outside. You can sit on top of the roof of the library and watch a movie projected on the aula. It's going to be about what we do with our nuclear waste. So it's not just about resources, taking them out of the ground, but also what do we do when we've finished with them. So again, thank you guys for coming today, and I hope to see you again next week, and otherwise after the summer with the rest of SG's programs.